So today's session is part of our Compliance Matters program, which we've been running for a number of years now, and this year's program is entitled Technology in Practice. So we're looking at particular elements of technology and how they are influencing the advice space. And today's session in particular is looking at data security and some of the risks that we face in business through the fact that by virtue of the fact we just capture data. We capture it typically onto systems these days. And there's a whole raft of concerns at the moment about how much risk businesses are facing when it comes to keeping data on online systems. There's a recent study conducted by one of the largest CEO networks out of the US, and they identified data security as one of the top 10 business risks they face in 2016. It's also recognized that data security is perhaps one of the highest risks from the point of view of world security, and we're seeing increasingly breaches of data security happening almost daily at the moment, and some of those breaches are significant. I'd like to share with you just very briefly a graphic from a website that I found called Information is Beautiful. The website's called Information is Beautiful, but it talks about data breaches over the last 14 years. I'm hoping you can see this on your screen. Can you see this on your screen, Barry? Are you able to see that?
No, not at this stage.
Okay, so hopefully now I've just shared that. Okay, so this graphic shows basically high-profile data breaches over the last 10 to 14 years. And you'll note as we start, like 2004, 2005, there's a few. But as we get towards today, you'll see increasingly data breaches or data losses that have occurred are increasing almost exponentially. You know, obviously there's things like Mossack Fonseca, which is quite important from the point of view of what's happened here recently, but it seems that almost every industry is at risk from data breaches. And we need to understand that, and I think we need to make sure that we've got controls, checks and balances in place to mitigate the risk of data breaches. Now, I mean, if you look at some of the companies that have had data breaches, it would suggest that, you know, trying to protect ourselves is probably quite challenging, because some of these people have significant resources dedicated to data security. So how on earth can we manage that? But I think we can, and I think there are ways that we can, in our practices, make sure that the data we do capture, we do have online, is protected. And we'll talk about some of the areas where we do have data risk over the course of the next hour, and we'll also talk about some of the things that we can do to help mitigate that risk. So hopefully that gives us sort of an insight into the content of today's session. I'm going to now hand over to Barry. Stop sharing my screen. And welcome Barry to our webinar this morning. Barry, good morning.
Good morning, David.
Thanks again for the work you put into this webinar. This is an area of particular interest for me, and hopefully for the audience, we'll leave you to do the introduction.
Fantastic. Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone's nice and warm on this brisk morning. We've got a bit of sunshine up here in Auckland, which is good to see. I'm starting to thaw out after a cold start. Look, over the next hour, what we want to do is firstly give you an overview, I guess, of data security and the legislation and regulations that we're bound by in business and especially in financial advice. So that just gives you some ideas of the fact that, there are potentially implications for, this stuff when it does go wrong. Then for this webinar, what we've decided to do is we're really lucky that David actually has a background in IT as well as being an expert in our this subject of financial advice. So we're going to look and have a discussion about firstly the 5 key areas of risk for advisors, and then also look at how do we manage those risks and what are some of the best practice ways that businesses can look at their data security and how can they handle it. These will vary depending on the way your practice operates and how much reliance you do have on technology. But from what we're seeing in the marketplace, more and more, everything, the paperless office obviously means that everything's in some form of technology, which while it creates efficiencies and is good from a business point of view, obviously comes with some risks. So that's pretty much what we're going to cover off today. So why is data security important? The key thing is these days, as I said, businesses are run on IT systems, and because you're in business in New Zealand and because you're financial advisors, you have obligations to make sure you get this stuff right. And when it does go wrong, it can be costly. We have seen instances where financial advisors have been, or complaints have been made against them and against insurers as well when personal information has been released without authority from clients. And in some cases, I've got a case in front of me at the moment whereby a advisor business has been, they use a CRM system which is provided by a product provider, and they've just discovered 16 breaches where their client information on that CRM system has been accessed by other advisors who are users of that CRM system. Now that shouldn't happen, and it's going to be quite an interesting case to see, A, why was that allowed to happen, and B, what remedy will be made of that. So yeah, a very interesting case indeed. So, what are the relevant regulations that you've got to be aware of? I guess the first one is obviously the Privacy Act. Wherever you hold personal information, and it doesn't matter what business you're in or what entity, even government entities, charities or anything like that, where they hold private information or personalised information, you have obligations to keep that information secure. You have obligations to let the clients know how that information will be used, and so most advisors will have a Privacy Act statement that they provide the client outlining how the information will be used, who will have access to it, and also where that information is stored. A lot of the time on those Privacy Act statements we see information that says it's stored at our office and gives the office address. And while that was good, we were all using paper-based files, in this day and age that's probably not the case. If you're keeping that information on a database, well that database, where is that database actually held and who has access to it? So for example, the case I discussed at the start, that information is held in a CRM system, but that CRM system is hosted by an insurer. So, and as we've found out, both the insurer and other users of that system have had access to that data, which was unknown to the user at the time. Under the Financial Advisors Act, there are obligations to ensure that you keep information and client files and examples of your advice. Interestingly, with that one, we've had another instance recently where we've been assisting with a client-based sale. And of course, when the client-based sale was made, the traditional, in the past, once you sell a client, you usually pass over the client files to the people purchasing it. The interesting thing is, though, under the Financial Advisors Act, you've of course got obligations to hold that information because you need to keep records of the advice you've given for the last 7 years. So now we've got a case where the information is going to be held A, by the original advisor, and B, by the new advisor. So making the clients aware of that fact, is something that is an obligation under the Privacy Act. And so the two acts end up interacting. Under the Fair Trading Act, the services you provide obviously have to be fit for purpose, but also you've got obligations under that to the client as well. And then under the Companies Act, if you operate as a limited liability company, you have an obligation to identify risks within a business, be it from the Fair Trading Act, the Financial Advisors Act, the Privacy Act. And if it's a known risk, you have obligations under the Companies Act to make sure those risks are managed. So as you can see, there's a lot of obligation under us to make sure we get this area right, as well as others. And in the instances where we have seen larger breaches that are more public, I guess, things like ACC a couple of years ago releasing information, there can be consequences such as fines, etc. for that. So if the lawyers got hold of it and decided to have a crack, they've got plenty of weapons to beat us around the head with. So the first thing you should be looking at around data security, I guess, is, do you inform your clients of how their data is stored? Remembering there's a lot of personal information we hold. If you're doing financial planning for clients, you potentially hold a lot of financial information on theirs. For insurance, there's a lot of health and personal data. Also, you potentially have bank accounts, credit card details, and a whole lot of information. So do you disclose where and how it is stored? And do you have the authority to share the client data with the potential service and product providers that you deal with? In some cases, we've seen advisors who think they can rely on the Privacy Act statement on an insurance proposal, for example. Well, and I've seen them cut and paste those into their own Privacy Act statement. But yet that statement states the insurer is able to use that information for the way they use it, but it doesn't talk about the advisor being able to keep it. So that's a really key area to double check up front. So obviously as I've stated, you hold a lot of that personal information, and so you've got an obligation to make sure that information is held securely. So we have a little poll to start off with. For those on the poll, you've hopefully used them before. Where do you keep client information?
All right, so for those of you that haven't seen this before, what we'll do is you'll get a question come up on the screen, and you get an option to tick one or more boxes, and we'll publish the results straight after the close of the poll. So we'll give it about 10 or 15 seconds. We've got 13%. Not really. People started voting. We've got 57, 62. See if we can get to 80% voting. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Oh, 83% voting. Fantastic. Okay, so the results, Barry? So the question was, where do you keep your client information? The results were 10% of the audience, so that will be probably 5 of the audience keep it in paper files on your local computers, so 26% capture it on local computers. Now, in this case, I did only give one option, so you could only tick one option, so it may well be possible that there's a combination here, but broadly speaking, 64% of advisors keep, or at least of our audience, keep their data online in some form, whether it's Xplan, Dropbox, OneDrive, or Google Drive. Yeah.
And look, we're starting to see that as more common these days because of the ease of use of those systems, especially since product and service providers have been able to accept scanned copies of applications or client agreements, be it investments, mortgage applications, have been able to be submitted electronically. The need for paper copies has definitely started to drop off. But then again, some of those, whether they're electronically, whether if they're on local computers, and in fact the client base we were involved with, all their data was stored on a desktop. Funnily enough, we asked them, "Where do you back this up as well?" And they said yes. And then they pointed to a little backup that was sitting on top of the desktop, which sat there with it, which sort of made me say, well, so your backup's sitting with the computer. So if the office burnt down, your backup burns down with you. Wasn't a very good backup from my. But well, so the first thing you've got to do, and that's why the reason we've got this poll up, is where are you keeping this information? So identifying where it is the first step to being able to then determine what type of security will be required for that data. And how secure is it? Cabinets. So under the Privacy Act, it actually states that the client data must actually be locked away. So if you've got a filing cabinet, the cabinet needs to be lockable and the office needs to be lockable. I've been to offices where there's a reception area that's available, or a receptionist PA works in, but when you walk into the office, the client files were sort of stacked up behind her desk, the ones that were in use. Yet when she wasn't in the office, if she went to lunch, of course, that office is completely open to anybody that walks in. Now, how many people are going to steal a client file? I always used to joke working in insurance companies when we had all this scanning to get into doors and codes to get in, who's going to want to come in and steal some insurance? But the fact is, it has to be locked away. I've already talked about how do you back up data, and is that password protected as well? So it's no use having a backup file that you take away, but if someone gets hold of the backup drive and that's not encrypted or password protected, then that potentially creates a risk. So you think you're doing a good thing by backing up the data, but you've created a risk as well. Online storage is one that we see that's becoming more prevalent. So this is your Dropboxes, your Google Drives. Interestingly enough, if you have any free data storage, i.e. free a Dropbox up to whatever it is, a gigabyte or whatever, and you're using that, funnily enough, if you read the terms and conditions, you've pretty much created a file that can be looked at by that particular company. It's a bit like if you have a Gmail address and you use it for business purposes, actually Google is allowed to look at that email, and they do. Well, they don't look at it one by one, but they definitely send their spiders to look through what's actually happening. So not very safe at all. So I would double check any terms and conditions of any system you're using for online storage. And then obviously these days you can have an app to access, be it Salesforce or Dropbox or whatever. And generally once those are set up, you don't need to enter the password each and every time on your device. So how secure is your device as well? And then there's remote access for staff and service providers. So there's definitely a lot of ways your data, once you've put it online, can be accessed. And so identifying those is once again a first step to figuring out, well, how secure is the data. So David, why don't we take a look at sort of each key area for this?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, you raised some really interesting points about securing data and securing passwords. And in fact, not long after this session, I will be sharing with you one of the password management, or the password management tool that I use in my business. But there's a couple of things that I think cropped up as you were talking there, Barry, and I think probably are worth discussing a little bit further. And one of those is the types of data that we are capturing in relation to our clients. And different types of data have obviously different levels of risk and different levels of sensitivity. So, for example, the client's name, address, email is probably less sensitive than client's credit card details or a client's health records, if you're an insurer. And I suspect that there are probably different approaches that we need to take based upon the sensitivity of the data that we are capturing. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, look, I do. And if you think about it, for example, with the online banking, you can ring up and say, hey, I'd like to talk about my credit card or my bank account or something like that, or, I've forgotten my password for my online banking. If you look at what security questions they ask you when you ring a bank about your online banking. So if you've got a client's name, you've got their address, you've got their date of birth, you've got their bank account number, and they say, hey, I've forgotten my passcode or whatever for my online banking, what type of questions they ask. Is it mother's maiden name? Is it your pet's first name? Now, the chances are in a fact find, while you might not gather the pet's name, a mother's maiden name may be there in the, personal history or something like that. So then you're starting to go, gee, what information if somebody really tried, enough to find. The same with the credit card details is really one, because if your credit card form you've collected for a product provider includes the little 3-digit code as well as the expiry date, well, they can now go online shopping with your credit card details. And so that would be a really important one. So one of the questions that pops up out of that is, should you be keeping that data somewhere that is accessible, potentially accessible if there is a breach?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the approaches that could be taken in that context is if you are capturing like a prop, a copy of a prop in your client CRM or against your client record, one of the approaches that perhaps should be taken there is to redact the more sensitive content, so that should a data breach occur, then that sensitive data is less at risk. Would you agree?
Yeah, look, that would be a really smart thing to do. So, for example, if the practice was to then once the form's been, sent through, and funnily enough, you talk about saving it onto your database or however you're storing the prop. And I think you and I discussed it yesterday. If you've emailed that to the provider, and your email system retains a copy of that email, you've got to remember there's a copy of the prop sitting on your email server as well as on your database. So one thing might be to delete the sent email once you know the insurer's got it, so therefore a copy of the prop isn't sitting on your email system. The second thing would be that when you do upload the proposal to your database to keep it, that you grab out a black pen and cross out the, for the credit card, if you cross out the expiry date and the 3-digit code, whatever it is they require, or cross out, the first 4 or 5 numbers or whatever it is of the code number, just so that that's not there. And then think about what is it that you actually do need to keep on your system, considering that the provider now has the copy, which you can probably get a copy of at any stage if required in the future. So that's definitely would be a good question to ask. What do we need to keep? And if we are going to keep it, how can we make it secure?
Yeah, and I think you raised another interesting point about email, and increasingly what we're seeing is particularly professional services, accountants, lawyers, and in many cases advisors now are starting to think more seriously about secure email. So that's whereby an email that gets transmitted out of your computer to somebody else's computer is encrypted before it leaves your device, and is unencrypted at the recipient's end, so that if it was to be intercepted through some hacking technology, then it couldn't be, the content couldn't be easily extracted because it's in an encrypted form. And there's a number of tools now, more increasingly, there's a number of tools now that allow you to do that. I'm working with, in my other hat, I'm working with a client at the moment, helping them to create a client vault. And as part of that client vault, what it does is it has a secure email tool whereby if you send a document to a client, it is encrypted in that way. So 256-bit encryption. So that the data cannot be captured. So I think these are the sort of things that I think that need to be thought about when it comes to capturing the data, and particularly the sensitivity of the data.
And that's the thing, risk assessment requires is, how much risk is required to the particular data that you're storing and or sending.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the tool that I'm working on at the moment is I think Westpac have now just picked it up as a vehicle for submitting mortgage applications.
Right.
So advisors now, rather than using email to send all the supporting documentation, are now uploading it to this Vault service that Westpac are now using, which I think is again a much more secure way of sharing data between two different parties.
Yeah, especially, I mean, we definitely frown upon when we see advisor processes where they're using, we've seen advisors using Hotmail and Gmail free accounts to send this type of data, and that's just crazy because it's open, and very easily opened. In fact, I think I saw a couple of those email providers on your first sheet where you showed the breaches. I did notice a couple of the advisors who might be worried that Ashley Madison was also one of those breaches.
Yes, exactly. Yes, hopefully
I
not
did
too
check
many.
the database, but I didn't find my wife on there, which I was pleased about.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. And your record was not captured?
No.
No, good, excellent. There's a couple of other points that you raised, and we're talking about this topic of client data. And one of them was in relation to geographic jurisdictions. So I wonder how many people who've got an online CRM tool or an online data storage tool, I wonder if they know where that data is actually being held and under what legislative jurisdiction that data is subject. This was a topic that came up at our conference last year when we were talking about IT, the sort of the future of IT in the advice space. And one of the questions that was raised is, look, do you know where your data is? Because potentially, if your data, if the CRM system you're using is located on US soil, you may well be subject to legislative jurisdiction of the US.
Yeah. And look, the classic, I mean, when we talk about data security, it's not just about somebody actually going in and finding it as well. The data security is, will it be there tomorrow, is the other risk. So, for example, had an advisor business been using Mega Upload, the original one, which got shut down, so you may have been using it for a legitimate purpose, but because the FBI decided to shut it down, all that data got frozen. So that's about the same as, all your client files suddenly being burned in a fire if they were hard copy. If the system you're using gets shut down for some reason, so then you'd want to look at, okay, how reliable and how reputable is the service that I'm using as well, because there's one that we potentially went through an episode like that, then you'd be going, gee, I wouldn't want to get caught out. And that's where the backup then comes in, because you can have online data stored in a Dropbox, a Google Drive, or OneDrive, but you can also have a backup service over and above that for the online data. So It's almost like protection against the cloud. So that's the other side of the security thing. Isn't about somebody just trying to steal the information. It's about not losing the information as well. Yeah,
exactly. I think that's pretty key. Is making sure that you do have access to it should anything untoward happen to the service you're using.
Yeah, look, it was probably one of the outcomes from the Christchurch earthquake was the difference between those that had hard copy or local drive files in an office in town, who, after the 22nd of Feb, they just couldn't go back in and get them, and never were able to go back and get them. So then all of a sudden they were starting from scratch based off product provider data, and what little information they had maybe on a phone or something like that. Whereas those that were on an X plan or an online storage system, of course, they were able to plug in the next day at another office or another computer, and away they go. So from a business continuity point of view, that's something to think about.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. Okay, let's move briefly on to employees and the risks that advisory practices face with having employing people to help them with run their business, or potentially employing other advisors. And I think the principles here apply not only to employees but other advisors who work in the practice as well. So if you're a principal advisor with a multi-advisor practice, there's some areas here that probably need to be given some really quite serious thought to. And I think, based upon my experience of small businesses, this stuff isn't done very well. So it's thinking of things like onboarding employees, so things like making sure that they are familiar with the policies and expectations of the practice when they come on board, and that would include, for example, getting them to sign a technology policy and process declaration that they've understood what the obligations are. Also ensuring that they only have access to what they need access to. So if you've got a multi-advisor practice, the question that gets raised is, should all your advisors, if you've got a CRM that you share amongst your advisors, should all your advisors have access to all your client base? Or should you be able to silo clients by advisor? It also revolves around things like password policy. It also there's also areas of things like remote working for employees. If they're working remotely, are there some policies that you need to think about that they need to adhere to? Are you still there, Barry? I think Barry's just disappeared. So we'll keep going on this particular topic. So in essence, what we're saying here, I think, is that if you are bringing people on board, and I think this came to light with the AML-CFT legislation recently, where it was expected that advisors who, particularly in the investment space.
Sorry, David.
That's right. You disappeared. You obviously lost your internet connection. We're talking about talking about employees and onboarding and offboarding. So we talk about onboarding, but actually there's the offboarding side of things as well. Is making sure that when an employee does or an advisor does leave the practice, that there are steps and mechanisms in place to make sure that access to the various systems is removed from those individuals, and actually formalising that process as part of the exit program for your practice.
Yeah, we see some of the systems around also are able to give you logs of when they've logged in and what they've done. So before they leave, for example, did they download the client database? Or contact details. So it would be good to check the systems you're using. Do they have an ability to say, for this particular login, can we look at a log of activities that they've done prior to or just after, before the login's actually shut down?
Yeah.
And at the onboarding stage too, obviously if you're an investment advisor or you're under AML-CFT obligations in your business, you should be completing police and credit checks and reference checks. But that should be probably standard practice across the industry these days, just to double check that as well from a security point of view. Who are you employing? But it is something that is required under AML-CFT.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and I think the AML-CFT process, although it's been proven to be a fairly significant overhead, particularly for a number of investment advisors, has highlighted some good practices, and things like, as you say, police checks of your employees, and you talk about it from an investment point of view, but actually, if you are capturing credit card details of your clients, it should be standard practice for all your employees to get a police check.
Yeah, we would recommend it. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're employing, you're a family member or someone you've known your life or whatever, then that's fine. But where it is somebody that is new, and sometimes if you're using an employment service, they will do those checks as part of their process. But if they don't, it is well worth doing just to be safe.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, Carol raises a point here. She says, are either of you going to talk about specific risks associated with home-based advisors? There's a lot of our audience, I suspect, would be like one-man practices with often working from home. I think the principles we're talking about here apply equally to home-based advisors, individual practices, and obviously the employees discussion is less relevant, but the principles we talk about here apply irrespective of the nature of your business, I would have thought. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. In fact, in some cases for the home-based advisor, you've still got the same level of responsibility as you do whether you're a large managing agency. Obviously, the risks are reduced by the number of people that have access, but if you're a home-based advisor who stores all your information on a home office computer, doesn't use online data storage, you've probably got the same risks as I said about the earthquake situation, or where if the house burns down, where's the client data now? Your risks aren't so much people potentially trying to hack into your system, though that is still a risk that needs to be managed. Your bigger risk is saying, well, what happens if the office burnt down? Now, and that's a business continuity risk of data security, not the data being stolen risk. So there's two sides to the data security argument.
So I think you're right. I think it's the issues or the principles are the same, irrespective of the nature of the business. I'm conscious of time.
So what we always talk about this a bit more, but when you do a risk assessment, the key thing is to do it, is to go, what risks do I have, and what are the possible, what's the probability of them happening, and what's the implications of them happening. So you may not end up going to the same level of investment to go through and protect that data as a larger business might do, but you still have to ask the same questions.
Yeah, exactly. And the as you say, potentially even if you don't face the same overall risks as a potentially a larger business, having those policies and processes in place, thinking about where the risks are, and then putting steps in place to manage those risks is the key, really.
And that's required under the Companies Act. So if you're under a limited company working from a home office, your obligations under that Companies Act are manage the risks.
Yeah. Let's quickly talk about mobile technology. And when we're talking about mobile technology, we're talking not just mobile phones and tablets, but we're also talking about things like laptops.
Yes.
And data risk associated with those devices. Now, one of the areas of risk which I think needs to be given fairly serious consideration is disposal of devices. So there's obviously the risk associated with getting your device stolen, and there are steps you can take to manage the ability for people to access the data related to the device as it's been stolen. But we've heard recently of a number of cases where people have disposed of devices and they haven't appropriately cleansed those devices from the data that device is holding.
Yes.
And there are, I've actually had to do this for a client myself. They had a corrupt hard drive, and for all practical intents and purposes, they couldn't read it. But we were able to get a forensic technician to actually go in and extract the data, even though the hard drive itself was useless. And the discussion around that was that actually, even if you've got a piece of that hard drive, if you could smash it up with a hammer, even if you've got a piece of that hard drive, you could potentially take data from that little piece of hard drive that you've got. If you are sufficiently capable of doing it. So it's when you're thinking about getting rid of devices, you need to give very serious thought to how you cleanse that data. And there are tools that you can allow you to do that. So it isn't just a case of deleting the file, it's a case of then putting...
Turned around and sold it or gave it to somebody else. You know, and you've deleted, you think you've deleted it because you can't see it in File Explorer, but generally that doesn't mean it's not deleted from the device somewhere. And so, you know, it would be, if you are going to on-sell the device, it would be well worth the effort to get an IT person to actually ensure that the data is gone, as they say, rather than, you know, you just can't see it from a login. But then the other simple thing is, you know, if you're not going to sell it, if you're just going to dispose of the device, then disposing of that securely. With the, you know, I know they do the e-drives where they take them all away and they all disappear, but, you know, once again, where's that going and what's going to happen to the device?
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. I think the key there really is, from a mobile point of view, is making sure it's protected in a relatively secure password and. The
thing I see is that obviously once you're on the laptop, if you turn it on and someone can just get in by clicking log in without doing a password, these days any web-based applications such as the CRM systems or the Dropboxes of the world, generally they don't require you necessarily to push in a password again. But if they do, a lot of the systems these days say, do you want us to save the password to save you having to log it in each time? So from an efficiency point of view, you might tick, yes, Google, please remember my password for Xplan so I don't have to type it in each time. But then what happens, of course, is if someone's able to break through that password, or you don't have a password on that device, be it a phone or a laptop, of course, as soon as they open Google, then they can open Xplan, or they can open, you know, Dropbox, and, you know, then all of a sudden all that data is available. So while there are some, I guess, time and efficiency systems out there that will remember passwords and things like that, if you don't have the front-end security on the device itself, then, gee, I know my 8-year-old, no matter what sort of security I seem to put on my phone, they seem to be able to look over my shoulder and do it somehow, I don't know, but, you know, there's access to a lot of stuff. So password protection and device security. And they're getting smarter these days too. You are able to put trackers on them as well, so the device itself. I know iPhones have them, and I know you can get them for Galaxies and things as well, whereby if you do lose the device, if somebody does turn it on somewhere, it starts pinging away, telling you where it is, which, you know, might not be a bad thing to invest in.
And I think broader than that, there are actually services now which will wipe the data on the device remotely.
Yes. Remotely,
so that's So you know, those are sort of things that probably should be employed within an advisor's practice, if, you know, should you lose the device. Now, which leads us on to the next topic, which is access and passwords, and it's an area that I often talk about because with my other hat on, I work in IT. I manage websites, and I manage a number of websites for financial advisors, and so I have to access. I think the last time I looked, I've got somewhere close to 1,000 passwords on the internet somewhere, which is so. What that led me to was to actually start looking a little bit more seriously at how I create and manage the passwords on the various systems I've got access to, and it's fascinating how many people either use the same password for everything they do, or they use these, you know, basic 1, 2, 3 passwords, or, you know, easily crackable passwords for data which is relatively sensitive in the expectation. So one of the things that I think is really important is that advisors give some very serious thought when they're putting their IT policy together about what they're going to do with passwords, both from a security point of view and also from a storage point of view, where they're going to store this information, because it's almost impossible to remember all your passwords particularly if you're going to do it in a secure way. And increasingly these days, when you
post-it note on my screen's not big enough for all of mine anymore.
Exactly, but increasingly, if you join a service, they are enforcing more complex passwords, and so it's becoming increasingly difficult to manage that stuff.
Should we have a look? I'm just conscious of time.
Yeah, we're heading towards 10 to 11. Yeah.
Let's get into that risk review bit, because I think this is the important bit about what we're trying to say should be done, I guess.
Yeah.
So we've hopefully highlighted where the potential risks are, and we'll talk a little bit more about those towards the end. And we're going to, David's going to have a look at that tool. But I guess, David, how you should do a risk review of your practice.
Yeah. So it boils down to, I guess, a series of steps that you need to take when you're looking at data security risk. And they're outlined here in this risk review process. But the first step, of course, is to actually take stock, try and understand what IT systems you've got in place, what data storage mechanisms you have, what types of data are you capturing, what are your business risks, both from a business continuity point of view, but also a client data security point of view. The first thing to do is to basically do an audit and stock take of the systems that you use in-house. And then you need to obviously establish the key risk areas that your practice faces. So we talked about things like the levels of data sensitivity in client data. Are you capturing health records? Are you capturing bank account details? Are you capturing credit card details? Those sort of things. To understand what it is you're currently capturing. And from there you can then start assessing the level of risk that you face as a practice and potentially start looking at steps you can take to mitigate that risk. Before I move on to the next one, do you have any thoughts on that, Barry?
Yeah, I think the key thing is doing that stock take first. And we see it a lot where advisors are storing information, potentially in 3 or 4 systems for the same information. So their emails and the information saved in, say, Outlook. They save documents and files for clients on either a laptop or on a Google Drive or a Dropbox, and then they put it all into a CRM system as well and potentially save it all there. So we sort of go, which leads to the point of view, if you have a look at all the systems you're potentially using, all the devices as well, you go, man, do we need all of these? Which leads into that next part of one of the ways of mitigating the risks is actually reducing the amount of places data is actually kept.
Yeah. Oh, this is the scale down, isn't it? The scaling down. Yeah. Only keep the data that you. Sorry. Only keep the data that you need to keep on any form. So if it's not something that you need to run your business, you probably shouldn't be capturing it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's stuff that you have to evidence of what happened, be it a file note or and look, these days with sort of the online CRM email systems, being able to keep records of those communications can be really important rather than having a separate place to put them all as well. So the question of whether you need data storage separately from a CRM system or a CRM system at all start to become a question. And the only way you can answer that is, what do we use it for? Why do we need it? If we're storing the data in document storage and we've got our email system recording all the activities, calendars and emails, do we need to chuck it into another system as well?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it's probably part of a broader discussion, but it is an interesting area. So we talk about scaling down, basically only capturing what you need to capture. The next step is to lock it up. So where you understand the risk, the data risks you face, but making sure you lock it up in some way, shape, or form. So that might be enforcing, strict password control on the data that you're storing. It might be enforcing two-factor authentication on some of the stuff that you're capturing. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. Two-factor authentication is used by some of the banks, whereby to get into a system, not only do you have to put in a password, but you then have to key in a code, often delivered through your SMS. But it's making sure that you've got strict controls in place to make sure the data is locked down and can't really be accessed by a third party. Any thoughts on that, Barry?
Yeah, look, in some cases this may sound like overkill, but it's going to be determined by the risk that of happening. But yeah, the two-level authentication, you can see it becoming more and more common. LinkedIn's just introduced it with the phones and what have you. The banking system's obviously done that for a while. If you suddenly make a payment online, it sends you a code to do it if it's not one that you've already set up, those type of things. Yeah. So we're seeing it in other areas. Definitely the idea that at the moment we can scan, fax, email, whatever proposals to companies and that quite openly, I would imagine in a few years' time those companies are going to be asking for either electronic systems to accept those or an encrypted solution like you've talked about, David. So I think everyone's catching up on this across the industry.
Yeah, I think with the number of data breaches that are occurring almost daily, I think it's becoming more and more important. The next step is to plan ahead. So thinking about this step is really preparing for the unforeseen, or the potentially foreseen, but not necessarily certain. So this is things like having a disaster recovery plan in place. What happens if your premises are destroyed? You talked about that, Barry. But it's thinking about what might happen to your business, what might happen to your client records if an event like Christchurch happened or some other unexpected event happened. How do you manage your data going forward? How do you manage your business going forward? It's also things like, obviously a number of advisors will be building their practices with the view at some stage in the future of selling that practice. And it's thinking about what you need to have in place from a systems and data security point of view in the event you decide to exit the business. We talked a little bit about this yesterday when we were talking about the number of CRMs that we have whereby advisors store their documents, attachments on the CRM system itself.
And they're a pain in the butt, I can tell you. We've just involved in one. So the transfer of data from one advisor business to another in the event of a sale, obviously if they're both on the same system, generally happy days. The system can generally do a migration, like an expand migration or something. That costs a bit of money, but they can potentially link it all up. But if you're going from one CRM system to another, the migration can be a pain. And as you say, if the attachments are in the actual CRM system itself, there's actually potentially no way of getting those transferred and linked up into the new one in some cases.
Yeah, because they're often stored in encrypted form.
Would I keep the documents stored on the CRM system? Should I store them separately? And I can tell you in one case where we've had it done separately, it made it really easy to do a transfer via file sharing. And that's been done quite quickly. And the existing business has been able to hold on to the advice files as well and close down the CRM because they didn't need to keep it open because they needed the files for the next up to 7 years for the advice process or Financial Advisors Act. So yeah, really think about that. How and when, how easy is it? And I definitely think that would make a difference potentially on prices once people start to go through it a few times.
Absolutely, I think you're right. I mean, one of the things that when I talk to advisors about their CRM systems, one of the recommendations I do make, and I think it's increasingly best practice these days, is, as you say, store the attachments that you would normally have on a client note or file note on a separate database, whether that's Dropbox or Google Docs or OneDrive or one of the relatively secure
Mm.
online tool with a link to that document rather than a copy of the document
Yeah,
itself.
yeah, I
So
agree.
the URLs hopefully don't change.
Correct.
I'm conscious of the time. Let's move on a little bit. Let's talk about shredded all policy. That's basically getting rid of data you don't need.
Mm.
So that whether that's a physical, paper, destroying the paper you don't need, or whether it's getting rid of data that you don't need in a secure that you've currently got on your system. Get rid of it, shred it. Make sure that it is not you can't reconstruct it. So that means deleting it properly, using secure delete rather than just sticking it in the trash can and stuff like that.
Cool.
Stay informed. I think this step is basically making sure that you understand and continually monitor the threats that your business faces, and keeping informed as to what the things like latest virus threats, latest phishing threats, those sort of things. It's just keeping yourself informed about what's happening, making sure you're up to date with your regulatory obligations. And Barry's already talked about the key pieces of legislation, but that's a continually evolving landscape as well. So it's really important we keep up to date with that. Making sure, for example, you have audit reports in place. For you talked about having the ability to audit when people are accessing systems. It's having controls in place to be able to audit what's happening on your system. So I don't know how you found out this. You mentioned earlier on in the presentation that there was a group of advisors that had access to the CRM records of another advisor. How did that come to light?
They found they went into a client file of their own, and they found a file note and an email link from another advisor to their client, and then they've found there's 12 instances of where this is happening, and the provider doesn't know how that happened.
Interesting.
Right.
Moving on. Interesting to see that. Yeah. Sorry. And the educate and enforce. So that's basically from keeping yourself up to date, but also educating any employees you have to make sure that they understand their obligations and their responsibilities as an employee. And we already talked about limiting access. Basically, lock everything down, limit access to an as-needed basis only.
Cool. Okay. Passwords.
Passwords.
Here's a poll. Where do you keep your work passwords? So, is it on a piece of your office, in a book in the office, on a spreadsheet? Does your web browser remember them, or do you have password manager software? How are we doing that at the moment?
Okay, so we've had not very many people voted actually. Give it another 15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's close this poll and share the results. So the results, Barry, are 17% keep them on a piece of paper, 37% keep them in a book in the office, 20% on a spreadsheet, 15% use Google, and interestingly 12% use a password manager software. So Barry, where do you keep your passwords?
My passwords are on a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is saved in a shared drive, which Karen and I both have access to, and the spreadsheet's password protected, but the spreadsheet isn't named passwords. It's named and quite innocuous and in amongst other spreadsheets. So someone would have to go searching pretty deep, we think. So that's where we've got our 200 odd passwords.
So you've got some steps and controls in place to make sure that it's pretty hard to find what those passwords might be.
Absolutely, yeah. And you have to get on the system first to be able to get even anywhere near where that file actually is as well. So we've tried what we think is relatively good practice. I probably know that it's not 100%, but at least we've had a go, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And to be
But
honest,
it
at
is
the end of the
better.
day,
I mean, a lot of offices we go into, we see on the walls that the office manager and the advisor will have the passwords to their systems on a piece of paper, in the office so everyone can see it.
excellent. Right. Okay, moving on. Okay, so this session, I'm very conscious of time, so I will cover this off fairly quickly. I mentioned earlier on that I've got something like 1,000 passwords that I need to be able to access. And quickly wanted to do is share the tool that I use to manage those passwords, because I think it's an example of some of the technologies that are available to help you manage this stuff, because it's getting increasingly difficult and increasingly complicated to do that. So the tool that I use, and there are a number of them, but the one that I use and I find particularly useful is a tool called LastPass. Barry, I'm just going to remove your presentation rights
Yep.
here. So I'm the presenter now. So hopefully, can you see that on your screen, Barry?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so the tool I use is called LastPass, and hopefully you can see it up here on the screen. The reason I use it is for a couple of reasons. One is obviously it helps me to manage my passwords in a very, very secure way, but it also works across every single device that I have. So it works on my my desktop, or my laptop, which you're seeing at the moment. It works on my Android phone, my desktop is a Mac. It works on my iPad. It works on pretty much everything that I've got. So it securely stores all my passwords. But it has some really cool features which make it very robust from my point of view from passwords. Number one, it obviously stores all your passwords in secure vault. It auto fills when I want it to. It has some smarts in place which allow me to decide, based upon the level of risk associated with that particular password, I can decide whether I want it to autofill, or I can decide whether I want it to enforce a secondary password, or in fact, if I want, I can force two-factor authentication on that particular password using LastPass. It allows me to generate random passwords, and I can specify the criteria against which those passwords are generated. So hopefully you can see here. Can you see that, Barry, where it says generate
Yes.
password? Yeah, you can. So I can generate a secure password, and it will then fill, if I'm creating a new login, it will automatically fill that password for me. Or if I'm changing my password, it will automatically fill that password in for me. I can specify things like it needs to be 12 characters. I can also specify the types of characters that it needs to be, and I can specify some other various criteria for generating the password. Once that password's saved, it automatically then updates my vault, which I'll show you in a second. It's got some other quite cool features, like it's got the ability to record secure notes. So I have, for example, details of my credit cards in a secure note. I have details of my will in a secure note, all stored in LastPass. It talks about any browser, so you can do it Firefox, Safari, Chrome, Internet Explorer, whatever. It works on every device, and as I say, it's got this little plugin that sits on the browser itself. Talked about two-factor authentication. The thing I really like about LastPass is local-only encryption. What does that mean? It means that when I create a password, before it leaves the device, it is encrypted to up to 256-bit encryption. So the content that leaves my device is basically a 256-character hash code, which is pretty hard to break. And even when it's stored online, it's stored in an encrypted form. And actually, when it hits the database at LastPass, it is re-encrypted. So it's almost impossible for anybody to access the password that you have. It's also available offline. So if you haven't got access to the internet, what have you, there is a local storage of your vault. Just briefly, how does it work? If I show you, this is my login to the NZFAA website. You can see this shows me this is my LastPass function here. It tells me I've got 5 passwords available for the NZFAA website that normally used for test purposes, but I can use any one of those logins if I want to, and LastPass has remembered it for me. And all the passwords I have are secure, so they're pretty meaningless to anybody that's trying to use them. So if you are looking for ways to lock down your various accesses, I would definitely suggest using a password manager. I use LastPass, but as I say, there are others around. So I will leave it at that, Barry.
Fantastic.
Let's go back to...
I definitely think it's probably better than my spreadsheet.
Let's give you presentation rights again. So we've got about 5 or 6 minutes to wrap up, Barry.
Great. Righty-ho. So look, I guess what we've been talking about obviously is IT or technology, and we shouldn't use it. We definitely should use it because it does create efficiencies. It should replace repetitive tasks, reduce costs. But the thing is, you've got to make sure that it does reduce your risk of data security rather than increase it as well. Now, we covered off when we first started the technology in practice. It's about, look, if you started with a blank page, you'd go through and go build the processes in your business. Now, obviously, you guys are probably already up and running with that. But a key part is, when you're looking at doing an audit, you're actually looking at, well, what are all the systems and tasks we use? And they can be quite big. Obviously, you've got your communication technologies, which gives everything from your phones to your video conferencing, emails, and what have you. You've got the key tools you use themselves, the actual hardware. You've also got your marketing systems, your CRMs, your websites, your online adverts, your social media accounts, your productivity technologies, once again, your CRM systems, your calendars, your online accounting systems these days, and your file storage, and then you've got your logins for your research and what have you. Then you've got all your customer service bits, so how do your customers interact with you with your 0800 numbers and what have you. We've worked out, and this was a while ago, that the average advisor business will have more than 17 different tech systems and or hardware items to manage. And so from a data security point of view, you'd be wanting to look at each of those 17 and go, what have I got to do? So our last poll, and in some ways it's a rhetorical question, but it would be interesting for us to know. How many of you have actually got the following in place? A written either IT policy, IT procedures for your team, or IT controls to make sure you're checking this up. So we'll just give you a couple of seconds to answer that.
And I've just realised this poll only allows you to to select one option, so my apologies, that was an error on my part.
IT policy, that would come, we would assume the policy would hopefully have some procedures or controls, but whatever you call it, if you have one of those, we're going to be cheering you well on the way.
So give another 10 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay.
You could work for NASA with that.
You think? Excellent. Hey, so the results, we've got 8% who have a documented IT policy, which we have 10% who have documented procedures for IT, and 38% who have controls for managing data and IT, and 44% is the respondent, so there's only 78% voted. Have none of the above. I would say that's relatively typical of the audience, wouldn't you?
Yeah, look, that would concur with what we're definitely saying. And look, it doesn't have to be a big, thick type of procedures manual. The policy could be as simple as deciding, okay, we're going to make sure our data is protected. That's a policy. We're going to make sure that access is limited. We're going to make sure data that we don't need is deleted. Those are policy statements. Procedures are, how do we do that? So procedures are, what do we do? How do we operate our systems? And controls are, how do you as a director of the business know that those things are actually happening? So yeah, a risk review, of those technologies that you use and the risks that you face to either losing the data or somebody stealing the data would be a great place to start. Obviously, if you do that, if you put those in place, then you're looking at obviously securing the data. Business continuity is something you want to guarantee. You want to avoid any expensive mistakes or any brand damage forever being, if it was made public that, data was particularly lost. So hopefully we've got you thinking. We know it sounds like a big subject, and I think we've got a couple of seconds there for if anyone's got any specific questions.
There were a couple, and we've got about a minute or two. So let's just quickly cover that off. Sorry if you can hear my phone in the background. I will give some money to an appropriate charity as a result. There was a couple that was raised. Sue asked about, she says, if you sell your business and clients, do you have to keep documents on all clients, or would not the purchasing advisor holding the documents for 7 years still meet the compliance requirements, as long as noted in the agreement?
Yeah, if you had an agreement with the person who's buying it, that they will give you access to it, which all sounds good when it's all happy days and they're buying the base. But it is your obligation, not theirs. So you need to ensure that you have access to that information, the advice files.
Yeah, I think that's the key, isn't it, really? It's whether you're prepared to rely on somebody else to fulfill that obligation on your part.
Yeah, because if they then sell the business, will the next person, So yeah, things change. But there should be no reason why you can't hold the data in some way, shape or form. And even if it is hard copy versions that you keep or download or a backup file that you keep and then lock away somewhere.
Yeah, that you've got access to. And it might even be just like CSV downloads of the records you had. Two other
it's
ones.
more to do with the advice documentation. It is an evidence of the advice that was given rather than the client data itself.
Yeah, point taken. Yeah, okay. Two other ones. Paul has mentioned it would be a really good idea for NZFAA to research a good encryption service to develop a vault service. We'll take that on board, Paul. I think we should probably come out with some ideas about what type of services would work for the email encryption in particular and document encryption. And Michael has suggested, do we have any IT policy documents that we can use as an example? So I think that's, again, something we should probably take on board and try and develop some skeleton framework for our members to take on.
Yeah, I think that would be something we could take away between us, David, because it wouldn't be too different from the AML CFT risk assessment type style and then procedures. So we'll probably take the headings we've got here today and start to put it into a simple format.
Perfect. Let's work on that, and we'll get something to the audience hopefully over the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Lovely.
Barry, fantastic presentation. Thank you. It's a really interesting area. It's an interesting area hopefully for the audience. Hope you online have enjoyed hearing about some of this stuff and have been able to get some insights into how best to manage the risk that you face as a advisory practice. Feedback, as always, much appreciated, whether good, bad, or indifferent, and ideas for how we can improve in the future. Have a very good weekend, everybody, a long weekend. Looks like the weather forecast, at least in the North Island, is looking pretty good. I'm not sure what the rest of the country is looking like. But enjoy your long weekend, and we'll see you online at our next webinar, which I think is, in Compliance Matters, I think is the beginning of August.
Excellent.
Thanks very much, guys. Thank you, Barry.